gaining some currency in the last few years about a hot-headed young Scots settler named Donald Morrison who killed a peace officer sent to arrest him on a criminal charge and then hid out in the woods successfully for a long time until he was finally cornered and captured by an increasingly frustrated police force. There's a novel about Morrison and a screenplay going the rounds. And in the hands of the fiction and drama writers, it's become a little guy against the law kind of story, with Morrison clearly a hero. But there is another version that may be closer to the truth, and it's really not so much about Morrison, but about the sociology of an immigrant community. Scottish television worked with History Television to produce this story, and for me, at least as interesting as the story itself, is the difference between the way in which this quite insignificant, irresponsible young outlaw is seen in Scotland today and the way he's looked on by contemporary Canadians. Donald Morrison, the Megantic Outlaw.
He was fighting for his own justice, that he'd been harmed or wrong had been done to him, and he was going to stand up for the right no matter what.
That man should have been allowed to live his life. He was adamant that he was not going to back down.
You get the mix of rebel and martyr. Two very, very powerful images coming together to some extent in the Donald Morrison story.
This remote and hilly region of Quebec lies 140 miles east of Montreal. 150 years ago, a steady flow of hopeful Gaels from Scotland settled in these hills and hollows at the far edge of the Eastern Townships. Out of this community emerged Donald Morrison, the object of one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history.
Donald Morrison was born in Quebec, so first-generation Canadian. And he was, of course, of that generation that really had been free from the landlordism that had blighted the Highlanders ever since the clearances. They no longer had to observe the bounds of their class that said you couldn't hunt, you couldn't fish, you couldn't lift a salmon from that river. He had the freedom.
The Gaelic-speaking Morrisons may have been free, but they were isolated. Owning land was a privilege, and Murdo Morrison, along with his youngest son Donald, worked tenaciously to tame and to nurture it. Their shared Presbyterian faith was a powerful unifying force.
It's a bigger story than just Donald Morrison. It really is a story of a Scottish community that were trying to make a living in a country that they weren't used to. The land that they were particularly on was not good land, and I think what happened to him was what they wished they had had the guts to do themselves.
The British-American Land Company once controlled over 1 million acres in the Eastern Townships. Their role was simple enough: encourage immigration. For many immigrants, the promise of a fertile plot of land was welcome hope after leaving their barren and unforgiving Scottish shore. Donald Morrison's ancestors from the Scottish Hebrides had little choice but to embrace the dense forests of the Eastern Townships.
An awful lot of them left because of sheer economics. You had the potato blight in the middle of the 1840s, and potato was the mainstay of their diet, really. So they had to go do something about getting food. The other thing is that childhood illnesses were being dealt with, and more children were surviving, and therefore there was more pressure for land. Once they grew up, got married, you couldn't divide a 3-acre croft between 10 sons, so they had to go somewhere.
The solution then, transplant them to Canada, to Lower Canada. And what they didn't know was the land they were going to get, which had been owned by the British American Land Company, was really the land that was left over after allocating the very best to worthy immigrants.
I think that people who went away to Canada and elsewhere in mid-century went away with enormous sadness. But I would imagine that halfway across the Atlantic, there was a kind of sigh of relief that they were going to somewhere where they would actually be able to control their own lives to a greater extent.
I knew that my great-grandfather came over here as a bachelor in 1842. He left Neep on the Isle of Lewis, and he disembarked in Quebec, and he got work there. And this, I find, is how my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather met. They met in Quebec City. And they had to work in order to buy the horse and the cart and the equipment that they needed to take over in this colonization.
And when they came to the Eastern Townships, they chose the furthest corner that they could find in the Eastern Townships where they could all live together, as they had lived, of course, on the Isle of Lewis, but it was the furthest corner that they could find, way out by Lake Megantic.
And I've heard about the dismay my great-grandmother felt when she saw where they were going to settle. It was right in the forest. There was nothing but trees.
If you look at a map of that part of Quebec, the map drawn of the land grants, when they were granted the land, it looks as if you literally took a ruler and just drew random lines. And if the bit that had been picked for you happened to be in the marshiest, swampiest, sourest, rockiest piece of land, that was pretty bad fortune. And I think that must have been the story of Murdoch and Sophie Morrison. The land they got was really pretty awful. Now, the plight was, what do you do with this? And to better themselves, they had mortgaged to get a better piece of land on the edge of Megantic.
But the land offer from the British American Land Company came as a shock. $3 an acre, a high price to pay. Nonetheless, settlers like Donald Morrison's father, Murdo, took their chances and set about carving out homesteads, rudimentary roads, and meager farming patches.
Their attitude must actually have been very, very positive. Otherwise, how could they have survived? When I asked one old lady who told me about all this, and she was 20 years later than the first lot, so she didn't have the worst of it, but she described her own experience, and I was almost in tears. I was in my 20s then, and when I finally got a moment, I said, I don't know how you survived. And she said, my dear, we had oatmeal and the catechism. In other words, the basis of food and the basis of faith. And that Presbyterian faith, harsh as we might say it was one of the things that kept them going.
It was a very strong society, strong community spirit, and definite community values of being independent, but also very good at helping each other. these were the strong values had developed early in that century.
They did have a lot of help, however, from their neighbours, and they fully acknowledge and warmly acknowledge the togetherness, the harmony between the French Canadians who were there, in the minority in that area, but they were good neighbours, and they taught them how to use their axes, showed them where to get them, and how to clear the land.
The Morrison family farm had scraped by over the years, but by 1882, Donald's father found himself tangled up in one too many land transactions and transfers. Mismanagement, remortgages, and debts were taking their toll.
And Donald, being the youngest of that family, I believe, offered to go out west as the only solution to pay off that mortgage. How else could they do it there? You could go across the line and cut hay in Vermont and earn a few coppers, a few cents, but you would have to plough that back into the land. And the only way he thought of making money, getting out of it, was to go out west and send home the money.
By the time he was 19, Donald Morrison, now a 6-foot example of stubbornness and determination, headed west. But the dreams of saloons and gunslinging on the frontier were soon replaced by the dust and grime of the cattle drive. The open range was lucrative, and Donald dutifully sent money home.
You still had some of the excitement of the frontier and the Wild West, but you wouldn't get it in the Eastern Townships until Donald Morrison came back.
His adventures as a cowboy lasted 7 years, until a letter found him in Montana urging him to return to the townships and the beleaguered family farm. With $2,000 in his pockets, Morrison climbed aboard a train and headed back east in 1883, unprepared for the turmoil ahead.